They said the Sherman burned like a matchstick. Men inside called it the Ronson, after the cigarette lighter, lights every time. In the summer of 1944, the fields of Normandy glowed at dusk not from sunsets, but from burning tanks. Somewhere near St. Lo, a young American tanker named Jack Fuller was crawling out of the hatch, his uniform on fire, his lungs filling with smoke. He could hear the steel groaning as the heat reached the ammunition rack. And then, a sound like thunder trapped inside metal. The turret blew open, a red plume reaching for the sky. 3 of his friends never made it out. That moment, that searing orange flash, became the symbol of everything wrong with the M4 Sherman. The tank that was supposed to bring freedom had become a coffin for the men inside. But in the middle of this inferno, one absurd idea, a trick so stupid it broke the rulebook, would quietly save more lives than any other upgrade in the American arsenal. It didn't come from generals, or from the engineers in Detroit. It came from the tank crews themselves, men desperate enough to try anything to stop their home from burning alive. Before that, though, to understand why they reached that point, we need to step back, to the world before the fire. When the United States entered the war in late 1941, it faced a brutal reality. It had no modern tank. While the Germans rolled across Europe with their Panzer III and IV, and the Soviets fielded the T-34, the most advanced medium tank of its time, America was still experimenting with prototypes. The Sherman was born not from perfection but from urgency. By early 1942, the M4 rolled off assembly lines like a flood. It was fast, reliable, easy to fix, an engineer's triumph in production speed. But it had one fatal flaw: its ammunition storage. The shells for its 75mm gun were stored vertically around the hull, convenient for reloading, disastrous in combat. When an enemy round pierced the armor, it didn't just wound the tank. It struck the ammunition racks, and then everything turned into fire. At first, no one wanted to believe it. Reports came in from North Africa. Shermans hit once and erupting into flame. Crews burned before they could even open the hatch. The official explanations blamed bad luck, or poor tactics. But inside the tanks, the men knew. They could smell the cordite, the scorched paint, the thick smoke that clung to their uniforms for days. They called it brewing up. To brew up, that was the phrase every tanker dreaded. In Tunisia, in Sicily, and later in Normandy, American tankers went to war knowing that a single hit might turn them into living torches. The British, who received thousands of Shermans through Lend-Lease, joked bitterly that it stood for Ronson, or Tommy Cooker. But among the crews, the laughter was gone. It was replaced by a kind of quiet fatalism, a belief that their tank, for all its mobility and speed, was cursed. There were attempts to fix it. Engineers tried adding extra armor plates, rearranging ammunition racks, coating the inside of the hull with anti-spall liners. None of it stopped the fires. Because the problem wasn't the steel, it was chemistry. Inside every Sherman were dozens of shells filled with propellant, dry, flammable, and stored inches away from the crew. When a tank was hit, even if the round didn't explode, the heat and sparks could ignite the powder. The fire spread faster than anyone could react. In seconds, the interior reached over 1,000 degrees. Oxygen vanished. Men suffocated before they burned. And still the Shermans rolled on. Because production couldn't stop. Because the war couldn't wait. Because in the logic of total war, a flawed tank in battle was still better than a perfect one on paper. But soldiers aren't paper. They bleed. They remember. By 1943, complaints were flooding back to the Ordnance Department. Letters from tankers described entire platoons lost to single hits. Some wrote in anger. Others in quiet despair. One, addressed simply to the men who built my coffin, begged for anything that could keep the shells from exploding. It was around that time, somewhere between Tunisia and Italy, that this stupid idea began to spread. No one knows exactly who tried it first. Some say it came from a mechanic in the 2nd Armored Division, others from a crew chief who'd seen British experiments. But the story always began the same way. A tank hit, burned, and the survivors, desperate to save the next one, did the unthinkable. They filled the ammo bins with water. To the officers it was madness. Water and ammunition don't mix. The regulations were clear. Moisture could corrode shell casings, ruin powder, even make rounds misfire. But the men in the field didn't care. They had seen what dry powder did when it caught fire. So they poured whatever they had, canteens, jerry cans, even coffee, into the spaces around the shells. They sealed them with wax, rags, or anything that could hold the liquid in place. It was crude, messy, stupid, but it worked. After a few skirmishes, the tanks that had water-filled racks didn't explode as violently. Fires still started, but they spread slower. Crews had time to escape. In some cases, they even managed to put the flames out. Word spread like rumor in a battlefield camp. Across Italy, Normandy, the Ardennes, whispers of wet racks circulated among the tank battalions. Unofficial, illegal, but impossible to ignore. Engineers back in the States began to take notice. Field reports confirmed what no one at headquarters wanted to believe. A bunch of soldiers, breaking every rule in the manual, had accidentally stumbled onto one of the greatest survivability upgrades of the war. At the Detroit Tank Arsenal, a quiet revolution began. Designers started experimenting with new ammunition storage systems, sealed and surrounded by a water-glycol mixture. Not just buckets of water, but a proper cooling system. They called it wet stowage. And within months, the statistics told a story too shocking to deny. Shermans equipped with wet stowage were 70% less likely to burn after being hit. 70%. In a war where seconds decided whether a man lived or died, that number meant everything. But this change didn't come without resistance. Commanders feared that water would add weight, slow the tank, complicate maintenance. Engineers worried about corrosion. There were memos, arguments, bureaucratic delays. Meanwhile, on the front, the old dry stowage Shermans kept burning. For the men inside, it was a race between innovation and death. Every week of waiting meant more graves. Jack Fuller, the tanker who crawled from the burning Sherman near St. Lo, would later remember watching a new shipment of tanks arrive. They looked the same. Same olive drab paint, same gun, same sound. But when he climbed inside, he saw something new. The ammunition racks were sealed, covered in metal casings filled with liquid coolant. He didn't know the chemistry. He didn't care. All he said was, maybe now we've got a chance. By late 1944, as the Allies pushed into France, the new Shermans with wet stowage were finally reaching the front in numbers. The difference was immediate. Crews that once feared the first hit now had a fighting chance to survive it. In after-action reports, one officer wrote, "Our men no longer bail out before the tank stops moving." That small line, almost casual, meant everything. For the first time in years, tankers trusted their machine. And behind that quiet confidence was a simple, almost laughable truth. A trick once dismissed as stupid had become standard. The Army's official technical manuals were rewritten. Wet stowage became doctrine. By the time the war ended, nearly every new Sherman rolled out of the factory with water around its ammunition, a monument to the creativity born from desperation. Still, for the men who lived through the burning years, the memory never left. They could still see the glow of tanks at night, still hear the screams through the radio static. Innovation, they realized, doesn't erase loss. It only prevents the next one. If you've made it this far, you understand the cost behind every line of improvement. The fear, the stubbornness, the courage to try something stupid. And if you believe more people should know how small acts of defiance changed the war, consider joining us. Subscribe, not just for the stories of machines, but for the people who refused to die quietly inside them. In the weeks after Normandy, the men began to notice something strange. Shermans were still being hit, that was inevitable, but the fires were fewer. When a tank brewed up now, it didn't explode into a tower of flame. It smoldered, hissed, and died quietly. The smell of burning gasoline still hung in the air, but the screams that haunted every tanker's sleep began to fade. In the quiet hours after battle, mechanics crawled into shattered hulls, examining what had happened. Inside they found melted casings, blackened water, steam bubbling from the ammo racks, but the shells hadn't detonated. The liquid had absorbed the heat, choking the fire before it could reach the powder. The system was crude but miraculous. The war machine had learned to protect its own heartbeat. To the engineers in Detroit, it was a revelation. They had spent years perfecting armor thickness, engine power, and gun caliber. Yet what saved the Sherman wasn't metal or firepower. It was moisture. Something so simple it bordered on insult. The solution had been sitting in front of them the whole time. At the Ordnance Department, reports flooded in from every front. 70% reduction in ammunition fires. Crew survivability improved beyond expectation. The numbers were staggering. Colonels and generals who once dismissed the field experiments as folklore, now demanded immediate retrofits. And as 1944 turned into 1945, the new Shermans rolled out under a single quiet promise: they won't burn like before. For the men who fought inside them, that promise meant everything. They still faced tigers and panthers, machines heavier, deadlier, with guns that could slice through their armor at 1,000 yards. But now, when a Sherman took a hit, there was a chance. A few seconds more to fight. A few seconds more to live. In the Ardennes, during the frozen chaos of the Battle of the Bulge, that difference decided entire battles. One morning near Bastogne, a platoon of Shermans was ambushed by German 88s. The first tank in line erupted as usual, a dry stowage model from earlier production. The second took a hit, but its crew survived. They climbed out, shaken but alive, as the water-filled racks hissed and steamed behind them. That scene repeated itself across the front. Each time, fewer coffins came home. Inside the tanks, the men started believing in the machine again. They painted names on the armor: Lucky Lady, Iron Duke, Daisy May. Superstition mixed with trust. And somewhere in that mix was gratitude for an idea born from panic and disobedience. Yet the war itself showed no gratitude. It consumed everything. In factories across America, workers built Shermans day and night, the assembly lines a blur of sparks and sweat. To them, wet stowage was just another design revision, one more checkbox on a blueprint. But to the crews overseas, it was the difference between seeing the sunrise or not. The evolution of the Sherman was more than mechanical, it was philosophical. It reflected the American way of war: adapt fast, fix what breaks, never stop moving. Each tank was a lesson learned in blood. Each improvement a compromise between what was ideal and what was possible. Back in the States, engineers began pushing the design even further. If water could stop ammunition fires, what about fuel? Could the gasoline engine, another frequent culprit, be replaced or shielded better? Proposals circulated for diesel variants, improved armor, new hull layouts. But the war moved faster than innovation could follow. The factories built what they knew. The men fought with what they had. The Sherman's reputation never fully recovered among its crews. They respected it, even loved it in a strange, fatalistic way, but they never forgot the smell of burning paint. It became a symbol, not of perfection but of endurance. Because the truth was, the Sherman was never meant to be the best tank. It was meant to be there. Everywhere. To overwhelm by numbers what it could not match in strength. Still, survival was a kind of victory. Each returning tanker, each repaired vehicle, each saved crew proved that innovation could bend the odds. In war, that was as close to mercy as anyone could get. As the Allies crossed the Rhine in early 1945, the rivers ran high and cold, reflecting the pale light of spring. Shermans rolled across pontoon bridges, their tracks clanking like metal hearts. Some were dry stowage relics, others brand new wet models. Side by side they advanced into Germany, the old and the new, the fragile and the evolved. The Germans called the Shermans easy to kill. But what they didn't realize was that the real battle wasn't outside the tank. It was inside, between man and fire, between ignorance and invention. Each improvement, each change in the blueprints, was a small act of defiance against death. At the front, crews grew superstitious about their new tanks. They'd touch the ammo racks before combat, whispering small prayers. They knew it wasn't invincibility they were touching. It was hope distilled into steel and water. Meanwhile, the men who'd once been scolded for pouring water into their tanks were now celebrated. Not by medals, not by ceremonies, but by the silent gratitude of thousands of soldiers who came home alive. Their idea had spread far beyond the Sherman. The principle of wet stowage would shape tank design for decades. Even the post-war M26 Pershing and the Cold War Patton tanks borrowed from that same philosophy. Control the chemistry, not just the armor. And yet, the irony lingered. For all the effort, all the engineering, all the science, what saved so many lives had started as an act of desperation, a rule broken on a muddy battlefield. It raised a quiet question that echoed through every laboratory, every command tent, every tank yard in Europe. Why does it always take death to make us listen? That question hung in the air as the Allies pushed toward Berlin. The Shermans, once symbols of vulnerability, now rolled at the head of the columns that liberated Europe. They weren't perfect, but they were relentless. And for the men inside, that relentlessness, that refusal to die, mirrored their own spirit. When the war ended, Many tankers returned home to factories, farms, and quiet towns. They carried scars the public never saw. But sometimes, in conversation when someone mentioned the Sherman, they would smile, not proudly but knowingly. Because they remembered both versions, the one that burned and the one that didn't. And between them lay the price of progress. The archives would later call it an incremental improvement. But for those who lived through it, it was a miracle disguised as plumbing. History rarely remembers the small fixes. It loves grand inventions, brilliant generals, decisive battles. But sometimes the fate of thousands turns on a moment of quiet rebellion, a soldier ignoring orders to pour water where it didn't belong. That's how wars are truly changed. Not in conferences or factories, but in the small human acts of stubborn survival. And as the Sherman's engines fell silent across Europe, the idea it carried, that even stupidity can be salvation, outlived the war itself. The war was ending, but the memory of fire refused to fade. Long after the guns fell silent, the smell of burning oil clung to everything, to uniforms, to the inside of transport ships, to the dreams of men who had lived too close to it. When the first tanks rolled back to the ports of Le Havre, their hulls dented and scarred, they looked less like machines and more like survivors. Steel that had once glowed white with heat now bore quiet testimony to the cost of learning. For many of the tank crews, it was the first time they had seen their machines in daylight, not through the flicker of battle. The paint was blistered, the tracks worn thin, the water tanks around the ammunition racks empty now but still stained from steam. They would run their fingers along those metal seams, the ones that had held back the inferno, and wonder how something so small could mean so much. At an ordnance depot near Reims, an engineer named Harold Dixon watched a team disassemble one of the final M4A3 Shermans with wet stowage. He had been one of the skeptics at first, the kind of man who trusted equations more than instinct. But now, standing among twisted metal and the ghosts of statistics, he realized how wrong he'd been. The water had saved lives. Not because it was brilliant engineering but because someone had dared to be foolish enough to try. That quiet realization marked a turning point, not in the war but in the human understanding of progress. The front line and the factory floor had finally met somewhere in the middle. Innovation had not come from a whiteboard or a command directive. It had crawled out of the mud, born of fear and necessity, baptized in fire. Sometimes, in moments between work shifts, Dixon would imagine the men who had first poured that water. Maybe they hadn't even believed it would help. Maybe they were just trying to buy themselves a few extra seconds. But those seconds, multiplied by thousands, had changed history. Elsewhere, across Europe, the remnants of the Sherman divisions were still fighting. The final battles in Germany were brutal, almost senseless, the dying spasms of a cornered regime. In the shattered cities, the tanks rolled past civilians who stared at them not as monsters but as symbols of deliverance. Few of those civilians knew that inside those tanks, wrapped around the ammunition racks, was the simplest secret of survival. The wet stowage system had become standard by then. Every new Sherman, and there were still thousands, carried it. For the men inside it was more than protection. It was proof that someone had listened. That their suffering hadn't been dismissed as acceptable loss. But even as they advanced, the tankers could not shake the irony. They were fighting a war of the future. Rockets, jet aircraft, radar, yet the solution that kept them alive was water. Primitive, elemental, universal. It was almost poetic. In March 1945, as the Allies crossed the Rhine, the Shermans formed the steel backbone of the final push into Germany. The bridges shook under their weight. Rain turned the banks into rivers of mud. And still they moved, slower, older but unstoppable. By now, the men inside knew every creak, every hum, every smell of their tank. The Sherman wasn't just a machine. It was a living thing. It groaned, it sweated, it protected. One evening, under a bruised sky near Remagen, a tanker named Earl Henderson sat on the glassy plate of his M4 and watched the sun sink behind the Rhine. The air was cold. Steam rose from the turret like breath. He thought about all the tanks that had burned, friends who never got the chance to see this side of the river. He looked at the wet racks below his seat, half full, still glistening. And he whispered to himself, "We made it." It wasn't a victory cry. It was an epitaph for everything they'd lost to get there. By April, the German army was collapsing. The Shermans, once so feared for their fragility, now moved almost unopposed. When they met resistance, it came from fanatics or boys too young to shave. Each mile forward felt heavier than the last. Not from fear but from exhaustion. Victory was near, but joy was nowhere to be found. Back in the U.S., the factories that had birthed these machines were already slowing down. Posters still urged production, but the urgency was fading. The workers, mostly women now, Rosie the riveters, packed away their tools and wondered what peace would look like. For the engineers, peace meant one thing: time to reflect. They began compiling reports, analyzing data, converting wartime improvisations into peacetime science. The term wet stowage appeared in official manuals, clean and clinical, stripped of the fear that had created it. It was now a specification, not a miracle. But history has a way of hiding the blood behind the blueprints. In the documents, it read like progress, an improvement in ammunition safety design. Nowhere did it mention the screams, the burned hands, the desperate act that had started it all. When the war finally ended in May 1945, the world celebrated in color and music. But among tankers, the celebration was quiet. They knew what it had cost. In the days that followed, some units held informal gatherings, men sitting on the grass beside their tanks, smoking, talking, remembering. A few poured whiskey into their ammo racks, laughing darkly at the irony. They had spent years filling them with water to stay alive. Now they filled them with fire to forget. That night, under a sky filled with fireworks instead of tracer rounds, one sergeant looked at his tank and said, "She's not the best, but she's ours." And in that sentence was the entire story of the Sherman, a machine flawed, redeemed, and ultimately human. In Washington, military analysts already looked ahead to the next war. They were obsessed with armor thickness, gun penetration, horsepower. But somewhere in those endless meetings, a few old ordnance officers spoke softly about something else: the courage to experiment. One of them, when asked what lesson the Sherman had taught him, replied simply, "Never underestimate stupidity under pressure." It wasn't cynicism. It was reverence for the reckless creativity that emerges only when survival is on the line. The wet stowage system would become a model for generations of tanks after 1945. From the Cold War Patton series to the M60 and even the Abrams, the principle remained: isolate the ammunition, control the fire, protect the crew. Modern tanks had computers, armor composites, automatic fire suppression, but deep down, the soul of that idea was still there. Water. Protection. Life. And perhaps that was the greatest irony of all, that the machine designed for destruction found its redemption in preservation. The war had forced men to invent ways to keep each other alive amid chaos. They learned that progress doesn't always come from brilliance. Sometimes it comes from fear, and the refusal to die quietly. The desert heat pressed down like a living weight. Inside a Sherman, metal groaned as it expanded under the sun, and the air shimmered with the stench of sweat, oil, and gunpowder. The crew barely spoke. Each man knew the silence, that long, nervous pause between the last burst of fire and the next. They'd seen too many tanks vanish in orange light, too many friends disappear behind hatches that would never open again. And yet, out there among the wrecks, a strange rumor began to circulate. Some Shermans, it was said, were surviving. Tanks hit hard by German guns, but they didn't explode. The crews crawled out, shaken, blackened by smoke, but alive. At first no one believed it. Every tanker had seen what happened when enemy shells struck the ammo racks. Even a glancing hit could ignite the propellant inside, a chain reaction so violent it lifted the turret clean off the hull. Fire and death had been inevitable. But these stories, they didn't fit. Men began whispering about a crazy trick. About some unit that had defied orders and done something unthinkable. They had poured water, yes, actual water, into the ammunition bins. It sounded insane. Everyone knew that water and metal in the confined space of a tank meant corrosion, mold, and trouble. But what if it also meant life? Somewhere near Anzio, a young ordnance officer named Captain Charles Kennard decided to find out. He'd spent months collecting reports from the field, reading between the lines of chaos. The numbers didn't lie. Tanks that had been modified in the field, unofficially, often at night, away from the watchful eyes of command, showed dramatically lower rates of crew fatalities. It wasn't luck. It was physics. Water, as crude as it sounded, absorbed heat. When a shell penetrated the hull, the flash of molten metal often set off the ammunition. But when that ammo sat surrounded by water, the fire stopped cold. Kennard tested it himself. He had the mechanics fill the racks of an old M4 with jugs of water and live rounds. They fired an armor-piercing shell into the side. The result stunned everyone present. The impact cracked the hull, but there was no secondary explosion. The ammo cooked off in slow pops instead of one catastrophic blast. The test range fell silent. Then someone laughed, not out of joy but disbelief. The stupid idea worked. By late 1943, the reports reached Washington. Ordnance engineers studied the data, and a quiet revolution began in Detroit's tank factories. They redesigned the ammo racks, sealing each shell compartment inside a jacket filled with antifreeze solution, a wet stowage system. The solution prevented freezing, stopped corrosion, and acted as a barrier to fire. Each compartment could hold 10 to 15 gallons of fluid. When the Army saw the results, orders were given to make it standard in all new Shermans. In early 1944, the first wet stowage Shermans rolled off the line. Crews immediately noticed the difference. They felt safer, not invincible but safer. It changed the psychology of tank warfare. For the first time, they could face battle without the same dread of being roasted alive inside their own machine. And that confidence, that subtle shift in the human spirit, it was transformative. When you believe your tank won't betray you, you fight differently. You stay a moment longer under fire. You push through the hedgerows instead of pulling back. You fight with purpose, not fear. Normandy would test that faith. When the Shermans landed in France, they were outgunned by the Panthers and Tigers. German tank crews sneered at the Tommy Cookers, a cruel nickname earned from the Shermans' early reputation. But the nickname was dying. The new tanks fought back, and when they were hit, they didn't always go up in flame. Soldiers began to notice the telltale white star rolling through the fields, sometimes struck, sometimes burning, but often still alive. Infantrymen cheered when they saw tankers climb out of smoking wrecks, gasping for air but unburned. For the men inside, that was everything. Each Sherman was more than a machine. It was a microcosm of human trust. The gunner counting on the loader, the driver listening to the commander's voice through the roar of the engine, the bow gunner watching for movement out the front slit. The wet racks didn't just protect steel, they protected faith. One tanker wrote home saying, "The new racks give us a chance to breathe. Maybe even to hope." Another said, "I've seen tanks hit and not blow. I've seen friends walk away. That's a miracle in this place." The Ordnance Department tracked the results obsessively. By the end of 1944, the statistics were irrefutable. Tanks with wet ammunition racks suffered 70 to 80% fewer catastrophic explosions than those without. What began as a field improvisation had become one of the most successful life-saving innovations of the war. And yet, few of those who benefited ever knew where it started. They didn't know the name of the sergeant who first poured a bucket of water into his ammo rack out of pure desperation. They didn't know the faces of the engineers who risked their careers to test an unauthorized modification. But they carried the result with them. In every mile of advance, every firefight survived. By the winter of 1944, as the Allies pushed toward the Ardennes, that stupid trick had become official doctrine. The wet racks were standard in all new models. The once feared Sherman was now known as the most reliable, easily produced, and survivable tank of the war. It couldn't outgun a Tiger, but it could outlast one. And when hundreds fought together, their mobility and resilience overwhelmed even the fiercest German armor. In the chaos of war, innovation rarely comes from ivory towers. It comes from foxholes, from machine grease, from men who refuse to die quietly. The wet racks were a symbol of that, the bridge between fear and ingenuity, between death and the stubborn refusal to accept it. By spring 1945, as the Rhine shimmered beneath the morning sun, Shermans rolled eastward in endless columns. Their crews were hardened, weary, and old beyond their years. But they lived. Many owed that life to a handful of men who had once been scolded for disobeying orders. The irony wasn't lost on them. Sometimes, to preserve order, you have to embrace chaos. In the distance, the smoke of burning cities marked the end of an empire. For the Shermans, it was the end of their long crucible. The death trap had become a survivor's chariot, not because it was perfect, but because it had been changed by those who lived inside it. War is the mother of invention, but it's also the father of defiance. Out of the fire came a lesson that would outlast the war itself, that courage isn't always about charging forward. Sometimes it's about refusing to burn when the world expects you to. The spring of 1945 brought silence, a silence so deep that veterans would later describe it as deafening. The guns quieted. The skies cleared. The smoke drifted away from the wreckage of Europe, leaving behind landscapes littered with the ghosts of machines. And among those hulks you could still find the Sherman, the tank that had burned so often and yet endured. In the days after Germany's surrender, American tank crews wandered through captured towns in disbelief. For years they'd lived inside a steel box, half prison, half home. Now they were stepping out of it, alive. Some ran their hands along the hulls of their tanks, whispering words no one else could hear. Others just stared, silent, remembering the ones who hadn't made it. One gunner from the 3rd Armored Division wrote in his journal, "We used to call it the coffin. Now, I call it the reason I'm here." He didn't know that his tank had been fitted with one of the earliest wet-stowage systems, or that the water sloshing around his ammo racks had probably saved his life in Belgium. All he knew was that somehow the fire hadn't come for him that day. The Ordnance Department's final wartime report confirmed what every tanker already suspected. The wet-stowage system reduced catastrophic ammunition fires by nearly 3/4. In statistical terms, it was a triumph. In human terms, it was salvation. And it had started with an act of rebellion, a few soldiers breaking the rules because they refused to die quietly in a design flaw. After the war, as the Sherman was phased out of U.S. service, its legacy became complicated. Historians debated its merits, its thin armor, its underpowered gun, its reputation for burning. But those arguments missed the point. The Sherman was never about perfection. It was about adaptation. It was a living thing, molded by the desperation and ingenuity of those inside it. Every bolt, every weld, every field modification told a story, not of engineering supremacy but of human survival. And that's the paradox of war. It destroys, yes, but it also compels creation. Fear forces innovation, loss forces courage. A stupid idea born in terror becomes a doctrine written in manuals. A handful of nameless men become the authors of survival. When the U.S. Army tested post-war vehicles, they never forgot the lesson of the wet racks. Future tanks, from the Pershing to the Patton, incorporated ammunition isolation and fire suppression as standard. The principle remained the same: protect the crew, not just the machine. That principle would save countless lives in Korea, Vietnam, and beyond. And all of it traced back to a bucket of water poured into the heart of a Sherman somewhere in North Africa. The war had taken millions of lives, but it had also forged millions of small victories. Moments where fear became action and action became progress. The wet-stowage story wasn't a tale of technology alone. It was the story of men who refused to accept death as inevitable, of mechanics who defied regulations, and officers who chose curiosity over conformity. One could argue that it wasn't heroism but pragmatism. Yet in the furnace of war, pragmatism is heroism. It's the quiet, unglamorous kind, the kind that never makes it to the headlines but changes everything nonetheless. In the summer of 1945, as the tanks were lined up for transport home, their crews scratched names and messages into the armor. Lucky lady. Never again. Home safe. Some of those tanks were melted down, their steel reforged into peacetime machines. But traces of that innovation, and of the men who dreamed it, endured. If you stand today before one of those preserved Shermans in a museum, you might notice small welded seams along the ammo racks, tiny inspection ports near the floor plates. Those are the ghosts of the wet racks, silent witnesses to an era when the line between genius and madness was one bucket of water wide. What makes a machine legendary? Is it power? Perfection? Or the lives it saves? Maybe the answer lies in that tank, imperfect, outgunned, yet beloved by the men who fought in it. A machine that burned less because someone dared to ask why. And maybe that's what war truly teaches, that the smallest defiance against death can ripple across history. That innovation doesn't come from comfort, but from desperation. That sometimes, survival itself is the most profound victory. As the final Shermans rolled home under gray skies, their tracks grinding against the docks, the soldiers who once cursed them now watched in silence. For a moment they saw more than a machine. They saw the proof that humanity, even in its darkest hour, could still choose life. This is the story of the stupid trick that saved the Sherman from burning alive, and of the men who proved that even in war, the will to survive can outthink the fire. If stories like this remind you that history isn't made only by generals but by the ordinary men who refuse to die quietly, stay with us. Because there are more forgotten truths like this waiting to be remembered. Herein in the fading echo of that promise, the promise of survival through defiance, the last Sherman disappears into the horizon, its silhouette outlined against a sky no longer filled with smoke. A machine that once burned now carries a reflection of peace. A weapon turned into a lesson. A flame that for once did not consume, but illuminate.